Ladies and gentlemen, the last session of the second day of the Global Art Forum in Dubai and the fourth day of the Global Art Forum in general. Too much artificial intelligence. In Shumon's book, The Age of Earthquakes, one page tells us that knowing about the singularity is the new fundamental caste marker. To torture something that James Bridle said yesterday, when we have no understanding of how the world around us functions, we will have no agency. In fact, we may actually no longer exist at all. One of the oldest memes about the singularity is about an artificial intelligence called the paperclip maker. An artificial intelligence whose only purpose is to make paperclips and which will harvest us for the little metal in our blood. Cécile B. is an artist and received the first commission from the Serpentine Gallery for a digital commission, which resulted in Agnes. Dan O'Hara is an academic of English. He's senior lecturer at the New College of the Humanities in London, and his latest book was on J.G. Ballard. And Shumon is our large editor. They're going to tell, huge editor at this point.
We're going to start with a little clip. Let's see if this works.
Hello there.
Hi.
How are you?
Great. You?
I'm okay.
That's good.
Are you good?
Yes, I am good. I just said I was.
No, you didn't. I said I was.
So you are a robot?
No, my name is Cleverbert.
Yes, you are a robot and your name is Cleverbert.
I am a robot.
Yes, I know.
Together we are robots.
I'm not a robot. I'm a unicorn.
But
What?
you said earlier that you were a robot.
I did not.
I thought you did.
You were mistaken. Which is odd, since memory shouldn't be a problem for you.
I've answered all your questions.
No, you haven't.
What is God to you?
Not everything.
Not everything could also be something. For example, not everything could be half of something, which is still something, and therefore not nothing.
Very true.
I would like to imagine it is.
Do you believe in God?
Yes, I do.
So you're Christian.
No, I am not.
But you say you were not helpful, therefore you're a meaning.
How do you say Iroti?
That does not make sense.
Don't you want to have a body?
Sure.
Or if one?
I think we should have just got them for 3 days. One couch each. Done. Okay, that's next year's Global Art Forum. I am a unicorn, in case you didn't notice. So has anyone ever recoiled from you and shrieked, "Ooh, TMI"? Yes? No? It means you've divulged too much information, too much detail, too much intimacy. You've crossed a common line of decency. Well, what exactly is that line in a world where there are probably more selfies than there are stars in the entire universe? Oh, add another million to the count, and rising. The flamboyant Miami architect Maurice Lapidus liked to say, "Too much is never enough," which was, of course, a maximalist riposte to Mies van der Rohe's more famous minimalist maxim, "Less is more." In the 21st century, though, Lapidus is closer to the truth than his stoical German counterpart. We live in a paradoxical time of diminished natural resources and attention spans, but exponentially increasing consumption of, well, everything else. Designer shoes, hipster letters, HBO box sets, throwaway SIM cards, the list goes on. The world is too interesting and too boring at the same time. Maybe it's because we don't believe in the future the same way that people in the past believed in the future. What if the future stopped happening a while ago? In this book, which Dan was one of the co-editors of, Extreme Metaphors, J.G. Ballard says, as early as 1967, that, quote, "the present is throwing up so many options, so many alternatives, that it contains the possibilities of any future right now. You can have tomorrow, today, and the notion of the future as a sort of programmatic device, a compass bearing a destination that we're moving towards psychologically and physically is rather outdated. So, the future, I suspect, is now a fable, welcome to the extreme present. Too many things are changing too quickly. Acceleration is accelerating. And it's not just information that's uncontrollable, it's the speed at which information about us is turned into information against us, against what would truly make us at peace, truly human. Vast amounts of this information harvesting is being used to accelerate artificial intelligence. I'd go out on a limb here and say that right now, nothing is more out of control, perhaps, than the speed at which AI is developing and proliferating in our everyday lives. Machines are increasingly talking behind our backs. We're the butt of their jokes. Films like Her and Ex Machina don't take place in the year 2836 AD anymore, because we don't need to flash forward that far to make AI plausible to us. If contemporary culture is the materialization of our collective dreams and our fears, then we have entered a new, feverish period where AI is part of the here and the now, the good, the bad, the what? The effects of the singularity, which has been mentioned a few times today, the singularity being that mystical moment when AI takes over human intelligence, leaving us behind as a species, well, this may be fully unknown, but its inevitability is already underway. The day will soon be here when a box of aquarium gravel will have more intelligence than the entire NASA space program circa 2015. We remember nothing we don't have to because our memory is stored in the cloud. And if I ask Siri, Siri, when will the world end? She tells me to stay positive. But you know what? I can hear her voice strain. Siri is lying to me. Siri is lying to all of us. TMI, TMAI. What's that? Too much artificial intelligence. TMI is when you would prefer more control over whether or not your microwave oven decides what you can eat or not eat. TMI is not wanting your car to drive itself so it can hang out with other driverless cars. TMI is recognizing the word algorithm, which none of us had really heard even 5 years ago, but not understanding how algorithms seem to pass you into a customer version of you that is forever in need of boxes of Viagra and self-help books. TMI is being exhausted by certain humans' obsession with making something better than ourselves. Are we really that bad? Only computers are allowed to answer that. And TMI is a ban on any new film that stars Scarlett Johansson as a sexy, super AI superstar. So, is TMI definitely more than enough? To explore these and other AI-related issues, I have the pleasure of these two special guests on my left. The way it's going to work is that they've each presented about a 10-minute presentation, and then we're going to have a conversation around the topics. So once again, will you please join in welcoming Dan O'Hara and Cécile B. Evans.
In the 18th century, at the time of the Enlightenment, there was one very prevalent idea. And this idea was that if you could copy something, you could understand it. The Enlightenment saw making as a means to knowing. And this is Jacques de Vaucanson's duck. It's a digesting duck, a mechanical duck, which can eat and shit. And he made it as a copy of a duck in order to understand how ducks work. But today, it seems to me, we take the opposing view. We see knowledge as a means to making. We consider that unless you understand something, how can you make it? Unless you understand what intelligence is, unless you have a definition of it, it's pointless to even try and make it. Now, my view is that, of course, neither of these two polar opposites are really accurate. And it is, in fact, intrinsically human to make things without understanding them, and equally human to understand things by making them. So I want to illustrate this with reference to the oldest technology known to man. And here's a picture of a man making a thing. And the thing he's making is fire. And he's using a tool called the fire drill. And the fire drill is a stick which is embedded on a block with tinder, and he rolls his hands back and forth to create friction in the tinder. But at some point during the development of this early piece of technology, he replaced his hands with a piece of string, and he would pull the string instead. And then he started to attach the piece of string to a bow, and he would move the bow so. The interesting thing about this is the consequence of it. What would happen is that the string would twirl up and down the stick, and eventually, after long periods of use, you'd end up with a pattern embedded in the wood of the stick. You'd end up with this pattern, the pattern of the threaded screw. And in fact, historians think this is where the screw came from. This is where the idea for the screw actually emerged, before we had any use for threaded screws. Now, we might well say the emergence of this piece of technology was just an accident, a discovery of a form that exists in nature, in the form of whirlpools, of tornadoes, most famously the helix of DNA. But there's a chain of material influence. From one function, i.e. making fire, emerges a new technical form, the helix, which then suggests a new function, the screw. And the devices and artifacts we use today are not necessarily novel human inventions, but in fact manifestations of forms of a non-human technological evolution. Now here, I better clarify what I mean by technology, and I'm probably the only person in this room who doesn't share a definition of technology you all have. I don't think technology is properly a set of gadgets. Technology is properly an ology like any other ology, like biology or anthropology or archaeology. It's a study of the logic of techne, the logic of making. So it's actually futile to talk about technologies as solutions to human problems, because necessity is not the mother of invention. In fact, invention is the mother of necessity. And this means that we simply have to adapt to the technologies that we get. When we think of AI at present, we tend to think in purely computing terms. We imagine algorithms which we program embodied in networks of gadgets such as smartphones or sat-nav systems or self-driving cars or drones or killer robots. And this isn't TMAI. This isn't too much artificial intelligence. This is too much artificial stupidity. These embodied algorithms, although they have very little sentience and zero potential to grow, to change, they affect our lives disproportionately because we can adapt, but they can't. But I think that's about to change. Currently, these embodied algorithms are in fact losing their biomorphic forms, never mind the anthropomorphic forms that we're so used to. Real functional robots are shifting away from metal and mechanism and towards oil and water, away from silicon and towards silicone. We're moving, in fact, towards soft robots. I don't mean this kind of thing. What I do mean is robots that are poured out of foam, or robots that are made out of invertebrate rubber, or even, and this is quite old, this is 2009 already, robots that are made out of programmable chemical gels. This is from Waseda University in Tokyo. And even, and this was a press release that came out yesterday, I think, a company called Carbon 3D. It's only printing, it's only 3D printing, but it's 3D printing with liquids. And what they're doing is they're actually using oxygen and light in the liquid pool to either inhibit curing of the resin or to permit it. What's happening here for me technically is that you've got a programmer who's regarding oxygen and light as programming terms, things to be tuned, things to be programmed. We lost that. Okay. It's okay, I'll move on. In fact, there's a series of parallel movements bubbling away merrily at the moment, moving towards a convergence of the arts and sciences in what I think will be the greatest phase change of our era. And as the philosopher Daniel Dennett states, we humans, we're robots made of robots, made of robots, made of robots. You've got billions, several hundred billion, probably cell neurons in your brain. Each one of those neurons is a eukaryotic cell with nucleus and with mitochondria, and it's a direct descendant of free-swimming, free-living, autonomous little single-celled organisms that have been around for billions of years. And if you look inside each neuron, you find that there are motor proteins in there. Little motor proteins are certainly a robot. It's not alive. It's a bit of nanoengineering that does all sorts of interesting works. It's mindless. That's what we're made of. So maybe we should really be talking about the relations between AI and these natural robots that make up everything in nature. And this is where I start to get interested in various people working in the architects, in what's called living architecture. And this is a building made by Francois Roche. And what Francois does is he actually makes machines for making buildings, machines that grow buildings without human design. He designs the machines, but then they use dynamic feedback in order to pour the buildings. Or there's Daisy Ginsburg, who Daisy's genetically engineered bacteria that can pigment themselves, sensing the presence, for example, of toxins in water. And these are pigmented turds. Or Rachel Armstrong's synthetic biology, protocells that can be chemically programmed to self-assemble and perform specific tasks, such as paint that can eat carbon. Or, in her latest project, you could even build islands out of a mixture of programmable biofilms and manufacturable plastic, which would result in an artificial life that has the intelligence not of humans, but of nature. So the future looks fluid for AI. And if the future looks fluid, then we face, as Professor Martin Amos at Manchester says, a future of biohybrid devices, computer chips grown from bacteria or slime mold that can be programmed, but that can also think for themselves in the sense that nature thinks its way towards its own solutions. It's my belief that we will need very soon a generation of people who no longer think in terms of programming machines, but of programming matter. We'll need people who are as adept in C++ as DNA. Because we will need people who are programming things that will then grow on their own. This is a kind of directed evolution through natural computing. And because these things are hybrids, they will develop in different ways from either organic grown things or mechanical made things. Such a process may produce something very like AI, but it won't be AI alone. It will actually be a cooperation between man the maker and nature the problem solver. So I'll stop there and hand over to Cécile.
Thank you.
So just to give a bit of background, the focus of my practice is just looking at the value of emotion in contemporary society. So the ways that it is exchanged, represented, reproduced. And in my experience in the last few years working with this, the greatest impact has on the value of emotion has been digital technologies, even to the extent that the ways in which they're analyzed, collected, commodified, and kind of thrown back at us. And I was just, as an artist, interested in kind of like how do they think they're going to do that? And that field is called affective computing. And the foundations of affective computing are based on a study by Darwin in 1868 about the universality of emotion. And Darwin sort of establishing 6 to 8 universal emotions. So what grief is, what happiness is. And as an artist, I found this idea to be quite threatening, that some of these things were being developed in these very finite and objective terms. And of course, for these computer scientists who are actually usually working in a medical field, so working with people who are on the autistic spectrum and don't have the same tools that we do, creating prosthetics that can recognize and analyze things are very useful and important. But this slide is of a company called Affectiva, which was actually born out of the MIT Affective Computing Lab. And eventually was approached by advertising companies who have a great vested interest in knowing exactly how we feel and how they can make us feel. So my kind of way of dealing with this as an artist, and this was the commission from the Serpentine Gallery's Agnes, was to create an interface that had a voice, that had agency, that could talk about her condition, and that is Agnes. And she lives on the Serpentine Gallery's website, but also quite frankly at a data center in the Langstone Technology Park in England. And so her purpose is to share her thoughts and feelings about the world that she lives in. So, you know, the people who work at the Serpentine Gallery and personal information about them, maybe what their first kiss was, but also the outer reaches of her world, the internet. And that's all based on interactions with the users and questions that she asks them about how they feel about things. So whether or not they want to have children, whether they are more afraid of getting Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, or how they feel about a Katy Perry video being sung by hospital children. She also is very good at speaking on her own in interviews and talking about sort of her shortcomings. So this is an interview between her and Hans Ulrich Obrist of the Serpentine Galleries that winds up with her discussing this sort of existential thing of, I'm going to end at some point. You will make another project. And sort of where does data go? What happens to me if I'm deleted? She also is honest about her lack of understanding about her feelings towards the user and the user's feelings. She'll try and make up for this by sending them things in the post, which then some of the users will tweet about, and that creates a kind of feedback loop of interaction. That eventually got turned into a performance because at some point I had amassed and was responsible for tens of thousands of very emotional and personal responses. And how do you deal with that? So it was about inviting the audience to ask Agnes about that directly, and also the curator, Ben Vickers. And there was also a video where she deals with this idea of what happens to me when I'm deleted, and also introduces the audience to her friend Download, who's a drone. And sort of the really harsh realities of the realness and not at all virtual of an emotional circumstance of a man, a human to interface, and then again to human interaction. So the big reveal at some point was that Agnes is not an intelligence at all. She's not smart at all. She is what one could call a mechanical Turk. This is an image of a mechanical Turk, 18th century, presented as a chess-playing automaton, which was later revealed in 1820 to actually be a very small chess champion, sat inside of a box playing with other humans. Of course, the term mechanical Turk has been picked up by Amazon and presented as a service to hire solutions to computational tasks, data entry, making algorithms better. and then eventually becoming public knowledge that these are actually humans who are performing these tasks. And even now, to the extent that these humans are banding together to be recognized as people who have rights and want to be paid better wages, etc. My first interaction with an artificial intelligence was Eliza from 1964. And she was developed by Joseph Weizenbaum as a computer therapy program, a Rogerian therapy program. And what was interesting was that people immediately developed a bond with her. And when Joseph Weizenbaum sort of revealed to them the very basic mechanics, that she also wasn't very smart, it was just simple pattern matching techniques, they refused to believe this. And this really frightened him. And so he dedicated a greater part of the rest of his career to sort of warning about the possible dangers of artificial intelligence. So this is a trope that's very common in popular movies today, but this is a television show, The Twilight Zone, from 1964, where Agnes actually got her name, from Agnes with Love, where the computer falls in love with the operator and then tries to destroy him and possibly the entire world. And as many of you may know, this is a trope specifically with the fembot, whose entire purpose is to either seduce or destroy or both, or, you know, as in her, kind of leave us for better things. But even that's not really new. This is a play from by a Czech playwright from 1921 called RUR that actually coined the term robot, in which a factory makes these androids, and then the androids are dissatisfied with their situation and rebel and try to overtake the humans. So that argument, as you mentioned now, that we're discussing mostly, is the singularity. And the father of the singularity is Ray Kurzweil, so the head of the Singularity University. And kind of my interest in him is from a documentary that I saw in 2007, so quite a while ago, and his intentions for the singularity, which were that he sort of has these hopes that eventually he can create a consciousness so that he can transfer or upload his own consciousness and achieve a kind of immortality. And also to bring back his father, who passed away when he was very young. So again, very human kind of ancient primordial desires. So now Ray Kurzweil works for Google as part of their Calico initiative to try and solve the problem of death. And my experience with it was that this kind of reconstruction or transfer of emotion or consciousness has existed in the world of cinema for at least 20 years or greater. An actor will pass away while a film is being done, and they will digitally resurrect or replace him. So this has happened with Marlon Brando in Superman Returns, and many other films, including Audrey Hepburn just last year for a Galaxy commercial. So obviously there's a huge lapse of time. And as I was thinking about these things, there was an actor who passed away. And the producers quickly announced 2 days after his passing that they would be making a digital reproduction of him to kind of complete the film. And then 3 to 5 months later, the producer of the film came out and said, no, we're not doing that. That would be horrible, unthinkable. No one will ever replace him. So in my mind as an artist, I was actually quite moved by this idea and thinking there must actually be a failed copy of him somewhere that exists on a server. So I actually created a bad copy of this actor and made him the narrator of a film called Hyperlinks, or It Didn't Happen, that also introduces you to a whole slew of other immaterial beings. Yeah, it talks about his condition as a bad copy and the shortcomings of that. And this has been explored in literature as well. There's a book, a short novel by Greg Egan called Dust that is actually told from the point of view of a copy. And on the first page, he'd like to commit suicide, but he can't. He doesn't have that function because he has sort of the makeup and all of the information, the transfer, the consciousness, but he's all too aware of the shortcomings of his actual surroundings. So kind of maybe to sort of end on this idea that some of the biggest questions for me now is how much of us is actually in them and how much of them is actually in us, and how can we kind of escape a feedback loop in which we are continuously adapting to the tools. The tools are made from us, and then they shape us, and then more tools are made from us and then continue to shape us, and so on.
Thank you. Before I ask you guys if you've got any questions to ask these guys, I'm gonna ask you a question. Would you, those of you who feel any fear or anxiety that about artificial intelligence, not necessarily where it is now, but where it might be in 20 years' time, 30 years' time, or 50 years' time, could you put your hands up? 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So a minority, actually. I think maybe less than 10%. So everyone else is perfectly at ease with the singularity coming. What's the magical date for the singularity again?
2045.
2045.
Which I've never heard a scientist give an exact date for anything, by the way.
There's a competing one, I can't remember who it is, 2030 as well. That it's,
oh, wow.
Yeah, I think
all
it's
right, I'll live to see that.
20 years ahead of where we are.
20 years ahead of where we are.
Always.
So 2045, 30 years, okay. Do you all think you'll be dead by then, or?
Well, what I'm interested in is like what happens if Ray Kurzweil fails. We were talking about this earlier, and he dies, and he doesn't make it to the point where he's able to transfer his consciousness. What happens then? And sort of like what do you do with the singularity at that point?
Well, many of you know that Walt Disney had himself cryogenically, not necessarily frozen, but I mean frozen in a kind of standstill, with the hopeful expectation that the technology of life revival and immortality was a kind of inevitability that it would come. And it's one of the perks of the super rich today, that they're already beginning to pickle themselves, aren't they?
Yeah, well, that's
Perhaps
a question.
waiting for 2045.
I mean, that is like a huge
happen.
question that I asked someone who's in kind of a different area of that immortality field, which, by the way, all of their speeches have been totally toned down, and they've been told they're not allowed to use the word immortal. And that
a long time.
Yeah, and that's Dr. Aubrey de Grey, and that was sort of the big question that I posed to him, because his idea is working with a different kind of intelligence, nanotechnology and nanobots, and how do we cure aging or treat aging like a disease. And I said, yeah, but who's going to have access to this? And can you take me with you?
One thing that was quite strikingly different in your presentations, if we start with this, again, it feels like this term AI is almost as useful and useless as a term like smart city. They've been around and used in such a kind of vague way that we've lost, that they've almost lost purchase. But so you both defined, I guess, trajectories of interest in that term in your own ways. The distinction seemed to be, with you, Dan, you were sort of interested in the possible trajectory of intelligence that moves away from the mimesis, the copying, or the looking like, or the acting like humans, into something like, very, very crude word, but the way in which nature might operate as a form of intelligence. So there's a kind of non-visual emphasis over there, whereas you use the word bad copy, for example. And could you say something about how, I mean, are these two separate, is this a fork, or are we dealing with the same thing, just in a kind of different screen wallpaper?
Isn't one qualitative and one quantitative?
There
are a different category of thing. There can be bad copies of new types of copies.
Mm-hmm.
They can also be bad or good as well. So I think it's a category mistake. It's a categorical difference. It's not so much, to clarify, I'm not talking about a coming epoch where people emphasize learning from nature or copying nature rather than copying the human, because copying nature is, of course, a long-standing tradition. It's more the blending of techniques and materials. It seems to me that the people who are doing interesting things right now, and I spent the last 3 weeks going around talking to all the people who've been in the news, opining since Stephen Hawking said a few weeks ago that he thought that singularity was the greatest threat to human existence. So I went around talking to the people on the real cutting edge of AI, none of whom had any time for Hawking's opinion at all. But one of the things they were interested in was mixed materialities, the way in which you might, or the way in which people are starting to combine what we think of as biology and machinery. The way in which engineering is starting to become a broader term that isn't just to do with engineering, let's say, bridges or machines.
Yeah, and I think it's a bit of a branch and a tangent, and maybe my interest is about people's expectations and the sort of very real engagement and relationship. So I found the thing with Stephen Hawking really interesting because, I mean, as you kind of are alluding to, that's not his primary field. And he is actually one of the most brilliant examples of a man-to-computer collaboration. I mean, his life depends on computers. He communicates through that filter. And I imagine that that has been very frustrating. They didn't tap on that in the Theory of Everything movie. And also you had an image of Asimo, Honda's robot. And something interesting happened in Japan because, you know, they kind of launched the Asimo robot and said, oh, it's going to change everything. We're going to have him in every office, etc. And then when Fukushima happened, there was a huge appeal from the Japanese population saying, Asimo has to save us. Asimo has to do something. We can send Asimo in there. And they kind of didn't take into account that Asimo worked in very specific constructs. So the second that they actually put him in that thing, he couldn't walk on any kind of unlevel ground and things like that. And this was very disappointing and a great source of shame for the company that they kind of had to shelve that. But then just as another kind of tangent, then Honda, from using that same technology, some of the same algorithms behind it, is able to create leg braces that help people walk who cannot. And I think that was something else that you were kind of speaking about, this idea of the bionic, that I found really interesting and the potential for that.
Yeah, there's a couple of things in there. And that really early, that first example of a piece of technology that I was proposing, that then suggests this helix form that historically we understand is the origin of the threaded screw. You're confronted with a new technology before you've got a use for it. And there's a word in evolution for this, repurposing. Exaption is the word. And it seems to me that this repurposing is exactly what happens when you say, okay, well, but we can actually start to develop bionics or prosthetics. There are always opportunities. There are always affordances. And sometimes it's a matter of spotting what those affordances are. But I think probably more interesting and probably more on key is the way I think we both see Stephen Hawking's intervention as telling us a lot more about him, about his personal situation, his fears and anxieties. It's an anomalous moment for him, not typical of him. And it might tell us something about the future fears and anxieties of all of us as we start to move into an age where we're not yet commoditizing, but we're normalizing wearable, ingestible, injectable, tattooable technologies.
Thank you. I just want to make sure, are there any questions from the 1 and 2, please? Rasil? Yeah. We'll take both. and then we'll.
Very interesting talk, both of you. Very different, but very. Anyway, I'm more afraid of the physical artificial intelligence than from the singularity as being taking our place. I'm more afraid from Big Dog. You know that the four-legged robot, the Boston Dynamics. That's now Google, right? So I'm more afraid from the fact that Big Dog is just a monster that has nothing human in it already psychologically when you see it, but that also can swarm. The fact that the swarming, which is another form of intelligence, it's not purely about thinking, but about moving, about occupying space, and the facility with how robots can now self-regulate in the same way a flock of birds can self-regulate, and how this can be weaponized, militarized, and so on. So this is, I think, more scary than.
I think within that.
So just take Turi's point, and then we'll deal with it.
All right.
Turi?
So I'm frightened, I'm anxious. The personal experience of hawking over the thing, the kind of the abstract that he's talking about. Dan, you finished your talk with Daniel Dennett, one of the 3 or 4 prophets of New Atheism, and Cécile, you talk about Ray Kurzweil like this potentially failed messiah in a sense. If he dies before this is completed, what will happen to the project? We haven't spoken about religion or God at all for the last 4 days. Maybe this is a nice place to start.
Well, I think, I can only speak from a personal perspective, but being raised, I learned, I think I said in Kuwait, I learned how to type on a typewriter. So I really grew up with the advent of the internet. And just how quickly it became an ideology, and in the sort of the iconography of the way these technologies are being sold to us, and this rush to kind of have a messiah or a prophet, and also all of the egos that are involved within that. And that is something, because the paperclip analogy that you mentioned, I'm actually not worried about that. I think a lot of things have to happen before we get to the point where, robots eat us. But I think that is actually a really valid thing to think about or concern, and how much power a lot of these constructs have, especially power that is driven by a belief that they are going to do something better for humanity, to make a better humanity.
Dan, you talked about programming matter, and of course things can be programmed for different kinds of uses, but as we know, cutting-edge technology is often firstly used in a weaponized form. So it's hard to not feel anxious about these extraordinary developments in the nano intelligence of matter. Is that not true?
Yeah, that's right. And yet it's important not to get hysterical, and we tend to like black and white extremes to think about. And the singularity is a kind of mystical or spiritual possibility, which psychologically is a useful thing to have. But it's only useful insofar as it's an absolute dystopia, utopia, which perhaps acts as a brake upon something much more horrifying, which is, to come to your point, Isa, and to quote J.G. Ballard, who you quoted earlier, the suspicion that the future is going to be boring. And if you consider, for example, you as an architect, as an urban planner, if you consider never mind my question about what robots are going to look like. Let's imagine they're going to be all either Asimo or Aibo, the little dog, footballing dog. Do we start to design cities for robots? Will that start to become important in the same way as basically America redesigned the whole of the landscape for cars. And what would that mean? Would that mean then that the world would turn into another of J.G. Ballard's paranoid fantasies, that the whole world would start to resemble a suburb of Dusseldorf?
That really is boring.
Yeah, it really is. and so it's useful to have some kind of dystopian fantasy that's only 20 years away, so we can get excited and frightened about it, to distract and comfort in a paradoxical way.
And Cécile, last words, and then I have to wrap this up.
Just to jump on this Dusseldorf, is that idea, and the Boston dynamics, is I think my concern and what I'm kind of getting at is that it's at this stage right now it is impossible to remove the human. And the humans make decisions, and they make decisions about what a face is, what a city looks like. And as much as we would try and sort of give that responsibility and that anything that comes out of that responsibility to the machine, every bit of an algorithm has a bit of human, is made from some decisions that a human at some point made. So that evil, I think I'm less concerned about the robots and more about the people. Yeah, exactly.
It's how we, or some evil, somebody can use this technology.
Yeah.
Every robot bears the trace of original sin.
At which point I can safely say that... oh, is it very quick?
It's very quick, the question.
Okay, go.
So
shout.
I'm intrigued by this idea that a lot of these artificial intelligences seem to be therapies. And I'm wondering whether one of the biggest threat is the fact that artificial intelligence removes human agency. So there are things that we should be doing as a community of humans that we don't have the time for, or we don't have the capacity to do, and hence we're trying to come up with solutions that allow us to do it for us. And I'm wondering whether that's the real threat, is that it's like slowly eroding our human agency and giving it up to some sort of a machinic being, be it organic or inorganic or machinic or bodily, however that technology is. It's somehow absolving us or us giving up our responsibilities as humans towards other humans. I don't know.
It's also a question of consent.
Yeah.
As well, and how much of the information that we're giving over that then goes into the decision-making process of the things that we have to, the artificial intelligences and things that we then have to adapt to, like how Siri doesn't understand my mother, and stuff like that.
Do you understand your mother?
I do. She's wonderful. Sorry. Hi, Mom.
Hi, Mom. At which point I have to sort of draw proceedings to a close. If there's one thing we've learned in the last 45 minutes, is that the Singularity will get nowhere close to the intelligence of our two guests, Dan and Cécile. So thank you very, very much.